Hey, it's Dave here, and we're on the third video of our little mini-series on bloating. And what we're going to do this time is we're going to cover the idea that an overgrowth of bad bugs in the digestive system can cause a lot of problems with bloating. We'll just explain some of the mechanisms behind that and also some of the specific bugs that tend to cause those problems in many people. So H. pylori is the first bug that I want to talk about. And H. pylori is a very common stomach bacterium. There's a bit of debate in the scientific literature and among medics and philosophers of science and physiology and things as to whether H. pylori is actually meant to be part of the stomach microbiome or whether it's not meant to be there at all. And so I think with H. pylori it's a very individual thing. In some people it's going to be hanging around and maybe not causing too many problems. And in other people, it's going to cause a whole range of different symptoms and possibly even more serious conditions, such as stomach ulcers and maybe even associations with certain types of stomach cancer as well. So we can't take H. pylori lightly. But just for the focus of this video, why would H. pylori cause bloating? Well, I had a lot of bloating when I had H. pylori. And one of the mechanisms, I think, is that although H. pylori per se on its own doesn't probably cause too much of an effect in terms of bloating, it changes the ecosystem of the digestive tract further down. So what the research seems to suggest is that when people have H. pylori, the microbiome further down the digestive system gets altered, and potentially that alteration increases the risk of bloating through the fermenting of the foods that we talked about, particularly the fiber, carbohydrate, sugars in the previous video. Now, there's quite a lot of complexity around H. pylori because one of the main symptoms is heartburn and acid reflux. And so if you go to the doctor with heartburn and acid reflux, the first thing that they tend to do is give you acid blocking medications. So proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole, lansoprazole, etc., that really suppress stomach acid production. The problem is that when you suppress your stomach acid production, as we're going to talk about down here when we look at the video on digestive juices, is that you open up the digestive system to invasion from unwanted microbes, because the stomach acid is really important for keeping those unwanted microbes away. There's a definite correlation between things like the increase of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or Sibo, the incidence of small intestinal fungal overgrowth with things like Candida. These things seem to increase when people have their acid suppressed through medications. Now, H. pylori alone in some people seems to have the ability to suppress stomach acid production as well. So with H. pylori, it's probably more of a secondary effect. It's what it does to the rest of the system that leads to bloating, probably more than what the H. pylori does itself, if that makes sense. One other mechanism by which H. pylori might exert an influence is, if you remember from the first video, I talked about this idea that when there's inflammation in the digestive system, the inflammation through something called visceral somatic reflex, which chiropractors and neurologists and people tend to be aware of, is where you have inflammation in the digestive organs and it actually shuts down the contraction of the abdominal wall or the abdominal muscles. And so those abdominal muscles keep everything nice and tight in here. And when they're shut down and they relax, everything can just sort of fall out like this, and people struggle to actually be able to contract those muscles and keep the internal organs in, the viscera in. And so that could be a potential reason why H. pylori causes sort of a bloated sensation, just because everything hangs out a little bit when the abdominal wall is shut down. Now, the next couple of different things that I want to talk about are Sibo and SIFO. So just as a reminder, Sibo stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and SIFO stands for small intestinal fungal overgrowth. Now, just as a quick aside before we get going on that, you can also have LIBO and LIFO, which means large intestine bacterial or fungal overgrowth. We want to focus on the small intestine at the moment because that's where most of the bloating sensations tend to happen in the majority of people that we will work with. You're supposed to have a lot of microbes in the small intestine, but there's even more in the large intestine. In fact, the large intestine has infinitely more bacterial and microbial content than the small intestine. And what happens with Sibo is the bacteria overgrow in the small intestine. So while you're supposed to have plenty there, you end up with way too many. And certain types are particularly associated with Sibo. You can test for them on a stool test. And you can also test for some of the gases that they produce in a breath test. And we'll talk about the testing methods in a separate video as well. But when these little critters overgrow in the small intestine, particularly if they're eating lots of carbohydrate and fiber-based foods, these bugs ferment the materials in those foods and produce gas. And that gas creates bloating. That gas can also create acid reflux and heartburn. It can create belching. It can create bad breath. It can create diarrhea, constipation, cramping in the digestive system, pain, all the types of symptoms that you'll typically find in people who have conditions like IBS. And by the way, about 60 to 70% of people with IBS tend to have either Sibo or SIFO. And so is it actually IBS, or is IBS itself just a symptom of having these things overgrown in the digestive tract? So these are really important factors to consider if you have bloating, and particularly if you have bloating that doesn't really respond very well to food changes, or if you do find that when you reduce your carbohydrates, the bloating goes away. Next group of bugs that can potentially contribute to bloating is parasites. And there are tons of different parasites that you can have in your digestive tract. I had a parasite called Blastocystis hominis, as well as my H. pylori. And I should have mentioned actually that I did also have a fungal overgrowth in my digestive tract as well around the same time. And the parasites can be really big parasites. You can have long tapeworms, you can have tiny worms like pinworm and hookworm. They're really tiny, you can barely see them. And you can have different types of worms in between. We don't see those very often, but because of the nature of those parasites, you can sometimes get a bloated sensation from having them as well. But more often than not, the types of parasites that people have are tiny microscopic things that you just can't see with the naked eye. You know, they're basically almost as small as the bacteria. And they include Blastocystis hominis, as I said, there's Giardia, there's Cryptosporidium, there's Dientomoeba fragilis, Cyclospora. They're all these fancy names, but when they get in there and irritate the digestive tract, because of the pain and inflammation and the swelling in the intestine, and also potentially because of some fermentation as well, then these parasites can also cause bloating sensations. And again, you're not always going to have bloating if you have these bugs overgrowing. They don't always lead to bloating. They can lead to all the digestive symptoms. And I think it's really important to realize as well that when you have these bad bugs in the system, they can all combine and through their own metabolic waste products and through those bugs just living their lives in your digestive system, they can create a lot of toxins. And those toxins can also be very irritating to the digestive lining. We're going to talk about those a little bit in the next video. And so just to summarize, the bloating that you have, if you're struggling with it now, is likely to be some combination of all of this diagram. But in terms of the bad bugs, the ones you want to be really paying attention to are H. pylori, Sibo, SIFO, and the parasites. And the way that you can find out what's going on there is to run a comprehensive stool test. And I'm not going to talk about the testing methods in this video. We're going to do a special video series on the differences between using the private labs to test your digestive health and using the tools available from the medical system, and look at the contrasting benefits and drawbacks of that. But just know for sure that in the majority of cases where bloating is happening, something is going on with these bad bugs in combination with a lack of the friendly microbes that you need in the digestive system to help it work properly. So I hope this video has been helpful, and I will look forward to seeing you again on the next one where we talk about all the bad toxins that these bugs can produce.